Before we begin, let's take a moment to explain why you're here and why this training is so important. Over 70,000 chemicals are used by industry. Some 15,000 chemicals are made in industrial laboratories on a large scale today, and between 500 and 1,000 new chemicals are introduced each year. These simple statistics provide the basis for increased awareness, training, and responsibility when working with any type of chemicals. As the environment becomes more fragile and our responsibilities in protecting the environment and people increase, training becomes absolutely critical in meeting these responsibilities. No matter how technologically advanced we become with improved machines, equipment, and processes, there's always the threat of an unplanned emergency. In emergencies, human factors, and specifically the training of those persons working in and around hazardous materials, must be of the highest caliber and intensity. The more you know, the better you'll be able to react to emergencies. Your training can be the difference between successful containment or prevention of the emergency. Hazwoper actually means Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. We'll discuss what this means and explain your responsibilities in meeting these laws, rules, and procedures. The objective of Hazwoper training is to provide the information necessary to help each and every person involved with hazardous materials to be able to respond effectively to any emergency. Now, you may say, I'm not involved with hazardous waste. I only work with petroleum products or toluene. Different government agencies, like OSHA and the EPA, regard these materials as hazardous waste if they are spilled. So everyone's involved. The protection of people, the environment, and property is the primary goal of Hazwoper training. Let's first begin with the federal requirements as identified in OSHA 29 Code of Federal Regulations 1910.120. The regulation is divided into three parts: cleanup operations at uncontrolled hazardous waste disposal sites identified for cleanup, routine operations at hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, or those portions of any facility regulated by 40 CFR 264 and 265, and emergency response operations at sites where hazardous substances have been or may be released. Employers are also required to provide supervisory personnel with 8 additional hours of training. Each person is also required to receive an 8-hour refresher course each year. In some states, like California, the state OSHA is responsible for enforcement of these laws. As an employer, Hazwoper requires a written emergency response plan, documented training, and requirements for post-emergency response operations. One word of caution: don't let the word emergency become clouded by visions of explosions, major spills, and/or hazardous waste sites. This regulation applies to emergency response operations for releases or substantial threats of releases of hazardous substances without regard to the location of the hazard. Basically, this regulation covers any hazmat incident response. Quickly, let's outline the basics of a written plan, which must address anticipated emergency responses, defined as uncontrolled releases of hazardous substances, which include petroleum and petroleum products, and emergencies that require response by persons from outside the immediate release area. Some of these examples include larger oil spills that require involvement of an oil spill response team, and fires beyond the beginning or incipient stage that require a formally trained fire brigade to suppress them. Emergency response plans must address a minimum of the following plan elements. First, pre-emergency planning and coordination with outside parties. Second, personnel roles, line of authority, training, and communication. Third, emergency recognition and prevention. Fourth, safe distances and places of refuge. Fifth, site security and control. Sixth, evacuation routes and procedures. Seventh, decontamination. Eighth, emergency medical treatment and first aid. Ninth, emergency alert and response procedures, which include the incident command system. 10th, critique of response and follow-up. And 11th, personal protective equipment and emergency equipment. Keep in mind, these plan elements address people involvement in an emergency response, but do not require you to respond to an emergency in any specified fashion. In other words, these plan elements are guidelines, but the persons actually working with the materials are most knowledgeable of the actual situation and should plan for emergencies accordingly. Your company may contract with an outside company to actually do spill cleanup, but you should be familiar with what constitutes proper cleanup procedures. Let's look at some definitions of the persons who may be involved. Skilled support personnel are skilled equipment operators needed only on a temporary basis. An initial briefing at the site is the only requirement for these individuals. Specialist personnel are regular employees who provide assistance to responders at an emergency response. Refining process operators who close valves and set fire monitors but do not fight the fire would fit this classification. First responders at the awareness level are the individuals who recognize and report the response event. A security guard is the classic example of awareness personnel, but it could be anyone observing the event. Consequently, all personnel should be properly trained for awareness levels. First responders at the operations level are the individuals who respond to the emergency response event. These could be the persons who try to contain the spill. 8 hours of training are required for these people. Hazardous materials technicians are persons who receive 24 hours of training and are designated to plug the holes or stop the release. Hazardous materials specialists also require 24 hours of training, but these are the hazmat reference experts who are otherwise qualified specialists in a particular hazardous chemical. Incident commanders are required to have 24 hours of training plus competency in specified areas. In some cases, there are requirements for 40 hours of training, depending upon the job and responsibilities to be performed. An annual refresher course is required for each of the above training levels. After an emergency, which is called post-emergency response operations, cleanup operations include the removal of product and/or contaminated soil after a product release. If the response team provides and completes the cleanup, then there's no need for a post-emergency response operation. Otherwise, if the cleanup is required after the response team completes its job, then the following requirements apply to the post-emergency response operations by on-site employees. First, training in the emergency action plan. Second, training in respirator use. Third, hazard communications training. And fourth, other appropriate safety and health training as required. Should off-site or contractor cleanups be required, they must also have the proper training and certifications. In September 1990, the new emergency response communications rules became mandatory. The purpose of the rules is to improve communication that pertains to the safe handling and identification of hazardous materials involved in transportation incidents, and to provide that vital information is immediately available to drivers, train crews, and emergency response personnel at the scene of an incident. Shippers and carriers of hazardous materials must follow these specific rules. First, shippers must include in or along with their shipping papers information necessary for effective emergency response. Second, carriers must make emergency response information available to the driver or crews of vehicles carrying such materials. Third, descriptions of materials shipped under not otherwise specified or generic descriptions must be more specific. Fourth, no shipper or carrier may accept a shipment for transportation that is not accompanied by shipping papers that contain the required emergency response information. And fifth, the required emergency response information must accompany the shipment in all stages. Let's look at what must be included in this emergency response shipment information. A proper description of the hazardous material, immediate hazards to health, risks of fire or explosion, immediate precautions to take in the event of an accident, initial methods to handle spills or leaks in the absence of fire, preliminary first aid information. This information must be in the shipping document, such as a bill of lading, or on a separate document. The separate document must contain the correct description of the material and the emergency information, such as a material safety data sheet. You must also use the Department of Transportation's Emergency Response Guide to meet this requirement. Shipping papers must also contain a 24-hour emergency response number to call for additional information. This number must appear on the shipping paper immediately after the description of the hazardous material, or if it applies to all hazardous substances listed, somewhere on the paper in a clearly visible location. All this emergency information must be stored where it is immediately accessible to the vehicle operator in the event of an accident. Each terminal site where vehicles are loaded or unloaded must have this emergency information maintained and available. There's a lot of planning and training required to meet these requirements. However, the true purpose of these laws and rules is to protect the environment, people, and property.
Currently, there are 7 major federal environmental statutes. Number 1, Clean Air Act, or CAA. This statute establishes ambient air quality standards designed to achieve and maintain certain air quality conditions. Number 2, Clean Water Act, or CWA. This statute includes a national policy to eliminate the discharge of pollutants into navigable waters and prohibit the discharge of harmful amounts of hazardous pollutants into these waters. 3, Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. This statute requires the development of information on health and safety effects associated with toxic chemicals and mixtures and procedures to prevent unreasonable risk of injury to human health and the environment from such chemicals. Number 4, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. This statute is designed to provide proper disposal of wastes by establishing procedures for identifying and characterizing hazardous wastes and developing standards applicable to waste generators and transporters, as well as owners and operators of hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. Number 5, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, was established to provide a mechanism for cleaning up abandoned hazardous waste sites. You may have heard the words Superfund program used to describe this statute. Number 6, Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments, or HSWA, modified RCRA procedures to include provisions to protect human health and the environment from groundwater contamination. Number 7, Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization, or SARA, reissued and extended the CERCLA regulations and established new requirements for emergency planning and preparedness, community right-to-know reporting, and toxic chemical release reporting. There are many other laws and regulations that apply to hazardous materials. The most important part of your job is to know and understand the laws and regulations, as well as company policy and procedures relating to hazardous materials, and to apply these procedures in your job. Again, this is a brief overview, but it's each individual's responsibility to know and follow these policies and procedures. If you're not sure about your responsibilities, ask your supervisor or other management person for compliance. With these regulations and laws, it's essential. If you're not sure, ask questions. Thank you.